Howdy, folks. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, the Mighty Bjorn. Today, going to be doing some Dungeons and Dragons discussing here because I think this is a subject that some people really don't think about really all that much, or they really don't add a lot of life to it. And I think this is a great way of adding more life to your Dungeons and Dragons campaign, adding, I don't know, just more flavor, pizzazz, if you will, because this is something that in my personal experience, most people seem to overlook. And it is something that we should definitely focus on more to add more realism, if we will, to our game, especially when we're describing our towns and our cities. And that's primarily merchants and vendors. There does not seem to be very much focus on that, and honestly being able to buy stuff and the different types of stuff that an adventurer would buy should be available at different types of vendors. And it can also add adventure and quests and things of that line. So let's discuss that here today. Now, this is going to be a pretty extensive list, but it's not really going to be a complete list because there's definitely many more vendors you could have, but this will give you a definitely really good idea of different types of vendors. And I'm also going to cover a little bit about what they would deal with. So let's get on into it here. Now, the first thing I want to talk about, though, is street vendors in general. This is one that I seem to see a lot of people miss. A lot of video games miss this as well. Now, Kingdom Come Deliverance actually did a pretty good job showing street vendors in the various cities, especially Ratai. And there was another fairly major city in the game, or larger city in the game, that also had street vendors as well. Street vendors would definitely be an important part of the day-to-day life in a medieval fantasy setting, especially because they were an important part of day-to-day life realistically, even in the frontier ages of the United States. Street vendors was still an important part of life. You would deal with a lot of your stuff at street vendors, such as if you want to buy some fruit or beans or whatever, it would be done through street vendors. And actually, with that being said, with street vendors, the placement of your street vendors would mostly be on a main street, and they would actually have to pay for use of the street, if you will, to actually be able to sell their goods on the street, kind of like paying rent or something like that. And it would be paid to the local magistrate or the local lord, whatever. And essentially, it was a price for doing business on the street. And usually, these vendors, like I said, would be set up along main roads, as well as your normal brick and mortar vendors, if you will, which I see a lot of people acknowledge brick and mortar vendors, especially when it comes to things like Dungeons and Dragons. Even Baldur's Gate had a bit of this, and Baldur's Gate kind of focused more on the brick and mortar vendors than it did the actual street vendors. The next thing I wanted to discuss with vendors while I'm on this is you really wouldn't be able to sell anything and everything to a vendor. Now, some vendors would buy or trade for just about anything, such as maybe, I don't know, maybe you could take a pile of beans to your local, the local butcher, and he would be willing to trade, some meat for those beans. But more or less, though, he was taking those beans as a personal item for himself. Maybe he was intending to cook those beans later with some meat or whatever. So trade was also an important part, but not necessarily everyone would buy everything. Example, a spice merchant would not probably take a sword unless maybe that spice vendor was interested in sword collecting or something along those lines. But so there's actually one thing I want to cover too while I'm on the spice vendor is spice vendor would be very important. Spice vendor would sell a wide variety of spices that he could get. Some of the spices would be imported as well. One of the most or more important spices would definitely be salt, and that's something he would probably have by the bulk. But he would also have things such as thyme, oregano, etc. Cinnamon would be another one, but that'd probably be a little bit more of a hard one to get. And when it comes to spices, especially plant type spices such as thyme or oregano, that's going to be more season dependent, as well as that's going to be more location dependent on how much they're going to have. Because an imported spice, such as I don't know, maybe some type of special pepper, that may actually have to be imported in because it doesn't grow in that location of the world or your world, if you will. Another one, a jewelry vendor. I notice a lot of people don't seem to think about jewelry vendors, but jewelry was, an important thing, especially when it came to status symbols. As well as jewelry, maybe a jewelry vendor would sell certain types of magical jewelry for your medieval fantasy setting. Another one would be the potter or pottery vendor. It would definitely be the potter, though, is what they would be called. And they would sell various things from cups to pots and basically it'd probably be like a lot of clay stuff or ceramic, something along those lines. But that's pretty much what they would sell. And once again, that's primarily what they would deal with. Now, when it comes to the players selling stuff to them, they would probably just trade in pottery or money for pottery, if you will. Another one that would be quite common is fruit and vegetable vendors, and these would probably be more along the lines of street vendors. As well, it's a seasonal basis. If they have peaches to sell, they would sell said peaches. They wouldn't be able to sell peaches all year round. Same way with something along the lines of peas. Now, you may have multiple vendors selling different types of fruits and vegetables, such as you may have a vendor who's selling leeks and peas, while you have another one that's maybe selling grapes and apples, or maybe they're selling grapes and peas, or apples and onions. It's whatever they grew on their land, and like I said, what was ripe and in the season is what they would have been selling in the market at the time, and you'd probably have a couple of them selling various different things. The next one I would argue too would be a cheese vendor. They would sell different types of cheeses. Uh, Most cheese of the time was kind of what we consider a cheddar, I believe, or at least what we would consider a cheddar now. But they would have different cheeses of different ages, with obviously different flavors, such as they may have a cheese that they've been aging for 6 months. They may have a cheese that they're selling that they've been aging for 12. They may even have cheese they've been aging for 2 years. And of course, those different cheeses would give off different smells, different flavors, etc. But that's pretty much all they would focus on is selling cheese because that's all they make. Now, this is something that could be a street vendor, but it's probably more likely going to be a brick and mortar type vendor, um, because more likely they would try to have their home on or near the market square, and essentially they would sell the cheese from their home, literally from their window. Of course, another one you have, and this would be less of a street vendor and more of a brick and mortar store type vendor, would be a baker. The bakers, you'd also have someone maybe selling just sweets, but more than likely the baker would just sell baked goods such as breads, cakes, cheesecakes, and they would probably also sell other types of sweets. Now, at that time frame we're talking about, if you're more focused on a medieval European setting, uh, a sweetener that was common at the time would be honey or some type of fruit nectar. Less often sugar, actual sugar, although sugar was in medieval Europe, it just wasn't very common, especially when you're looking in the early to even late medieval period. Late medieval period is where you start seeing a little bit more in the way of sugar, as well as into the Renaissance. But that is actually a seasoning, a spice, if you will, that is traded exotically, and it is imported from other countries. Another one that you'd probably have would be a herbalist. Now, this is even one that you could use as a traveling merchant, if you will, as a herbalist, and they would sell. Of course, in a medieval fantasy setting, they would sell some type of healing herbs, more than likely, or some type of herbs that could be used to treat poisons, as well as wounds. But also, they would sell more mundane things. They might sell spices, especially stuff like oregano or parsley or mint, anything along those lines. They might even sell leeks because leeks can be easily accessed, grown in the wild. They might sell turnips, like wild turnips. They might sell wild potatoes, even wild different types of wild berries. So they would even sell more mundane things, if you will. And I would base that on area, season, time of year, type of terrain, type of generalized weather, if you will. If it's a more temperate climate, you might find more different things more available, or more things available, but it's going to be seasonal based. Now, the next one, too, is the butcher. I would argue the butcher is probably one of the more important ones on the list because, well, they're the ones that sells the meat, and adventurers generally love meat. And they're going to sell multiple different types of meat. They're going to sell, anything from sausages to pig's heads to bacon. They're going to sell fresh meats. They're going to sell smoked meats. They're going to sell dried meats. Uh, they may sell fish. They may not sell fish in large quantities. That would be based on the location and how accessible fish are. Of course, as you get closer to the ocean, they might do things like sell crab, lobster, which actually at the time would be considered a cheaper poor man's meat, as well as fish in general was considered a cheaper poor man's meat, even something like salmon, because it was free and easily accessible. All you had to do was fish for it. Now, another one that people may not think about or may not think is important, but may be a good way to set some quest up is actually a florist. Yes, flowers would be commonly sold, and even in the medieval period, although may not sell a lot of them. I don't know how that would go, at least not to adventurers anyway. Another one would be a fabric merchant. The fabric merchant would definitely be really important, especially to other businesses such as the tailor, which the tailor would be important as well. The tailor, probably the fabric merchant and the tailor would almost work hand in hand, but you should have different, the fabric merchant would sell different types of fabrics, would sell wool, would sell linen, would be the most common two things in medieval Europe, but you'd also at a higher price find silk. Now, with that being said, maybe if you wanted to do something more correct in, say, an Asian kind of Chinese influenced section of your world, if you have one, would be silk would actually be actually relatively cheap, because the Chinese actually had silk farms where they would grow different. I believe they grew silkworms to make silk. Where on the other hand, in medieval Europe, they relied a lot on linen, which is actually a really good fabric, very breathable fabric. Now, another one you could have is, obviously a lot of people would probably think about this one is the potion maker, the potion merchant. It could be the apothecary if you wanted to say specialize in just the more in the end of healing, if you will. But the apothecary, or sorry, the potion or the alchemist might sell different types of oils, different types of potions, even simple tonics, for things such as sleeping or headaches. Um, you could have this kind of divvied up in different ways, as such as you may have an apothecary, but then you also may have an alchemist as well, depending upon how that goes. I mean, the apothecary is more focused towards healing, but the apothecary would also sell different types of potions, tonics, etc. The scribe would be another one. The scribe would out mostly deal with books, but the scribe would also write scrolls and things of that nature. So Who knows? Maybe you do have a scribe that is actually a wizard and writes scrolls and sells them. So, yeah, just another idea. And of course, you could work quest with this too. If it is some type of wizard, maybe he wants some type of spell book or something. So think about that in your D&D campaigns. You'd also have a carpenter. Now, the carpenter would do lots of different things, such as making cabinets, making chests, boxes. Carpenter may even make the coffins, if you will. But it's another one of those things that would make your campaign more lively if, you know, your PCs are walking down the street and they see the carpenter. Something probably not a lot of game masters thinks about is the carpenter. And maybe the carpenter would even also have quest as well, while I think the carpenter would be not necessarily a common stop for the adventurers. You might be able to work something out on that end. Of course, we all know of the old blacksmith. Everybody's got blacksmith. There's always a blacksmith. Now, I work this in different ways. Uh, I do have a blacksmith. Usually, every town will have a blacksmith, and basically, the tasks go from the more mundane to the more specialized. So, the village blacksmith, if you will, if there's just a blacksmith in the village, he might make, he's more than commonly going to make hardware, nails, horseshoes, etc. But then you might have something more specialized where you have an actual armor smith, maybe in a larger city or a larger village. You have an actual armor smith, and that's the person you go to for your master crafted armor. While the village may also still have a generalized blacksmith. Now, with the armor smith, that's probably the person you're going to need to see for full plate armor, or at least that's how I do it in my campaign. They do the mastercraft armors. They also do the more complex armors. Same way along the lines of the weaponsmith. The weaponsmith only makes crafts weapons. And if you want a masterwork weapon, that's who you're going to have to go see. As well as when I work my vendors, I tend to also mentally limit what types of stuff that they're going to sell. So maybe while you can buy an arming sword, or in Dungeons and Dragons terms, a long sword at just about any blacksmith, a weaponsmith might be the only one you're going to see that sells great swords. So that's just a thought in itself. Another one that would be important is a tanner, and I've actually worked the tanners in different ways. Sometimes I just have a tanner as a tanner that they create, take and tan and treat leather. Sometimes the tanners also make armor. Now, this would be the leather, the studded leather. That might be something that the tanner would handle, as well as the tanner would trade in, as well as the shoemaker. The shoemaker is another one you could use as quote unquote a you know create maker or creator of leather armor. Maybe the armor smith would do that too if you had an armor smith. So, but that's something to think about, is who should be working the leather in your towns and villages, etc. And actually, the shoemaker, the actual proper term for the shoemaker is the cobbler. There's also the Fletcher. This one actually threw my players off recently when they went into a town to sell a bunch of equipment they had looted off of some goblins and orcs. The party actually had a few bows for sale, and I told them they would have to go see the Fletcher, and they got confused because they haven't heard that term. Apparently, they're younger guys, and people that deal with bows aren't necessarily called Fletcher so much anymore. But that's who you deal with. Your bows, your arrows, your crossbows, they would all come from the Fletcher. Now, another one that I do have set up for my D&D campaigns is a magic shop. Now, the magic shop is kind of a more generalized magic shop. Think of a general store, but related to magic things. It might be called an antique shop. I call it different things actually within my D&D campaign. It's just kind of based on what town the players walk into is what I call it. And they'll sell everything from potions to scrolls, spell books, ever burning torches. Uh, the list just kind of goes on and on. They sometimes will have magic weapons and magic reins, magic cloaks. Like I said, it's kind of a general store for magic items. So that's I would say that's kind of a tropey shop, but it is something to think about as even though it is a trope, and I personally I don't think it would exist, but there you go. As well as the general store. The general store is another one that would be definitely an important stop for the party. That's where they're going to go buy their rations. Maybe that's where they would go to buy a cloak or a tent or pretty much whatever torches. That your general store is going to have a mix of everything, and this is another one that's kind of tropey, and it does seem to make everybody seems to have a general store within their campaign, and this is probably going to be one of the more common stores that you're going to see from town to town is a general store. Some of these vendors you may not see all over the place, like a magic store. I don't have those everywhere. I have those mostly only in major cities. Meanwhile, in minor villages and stuff like that, you're going to, you know, not find something like that. Where the general store you're going to find all over the place. Another one, too, I would argue, is an exotics store. Stuff that is not local and is imported from other countries, jewelry, statues, etc. I wouldn't say this is going to be a common store, but it should be maybe a store in your D&D campaign. That jade elephant statue you found, that might be somewhere to sell at a more exotic type store. Now, something else to think about within your D&D campaign, or I think is that something I've worked is even traveling merchants. You might see them camped alongside a road or whatever. The good old gypsy would be a good one that you might find a gypsy just selling random stuff alongside the road. They might be selling fruit or vegetables, flowers, herbs, pottery, all kinds of different random stuff, and they might even trade in all kinds of random different stuff. So, just an idea for you, and there's multiple different ways of doing traveling merchants. I actually thought of a cool traveling merchant recently related to using an ankylosaurus. Of course, you have the stables. The stables are going to cover different various things. You may actually rent out a stable for your horse, as well as the stables may do such things as checking the horse's hooves, doing any treatment necessary for them. They may brush the horse for you, wash the horse. They'll definitely feed and water the horse, etc. Also, the stable is where you're going to go to buy a horse, as well as horse related equipment, including the saddle. Now, if you need something more, if you wanted, say, a more custom made saddle, you might end up having to go over to the tanner or the cobbler to have something like that done, or some other leather worker. And then the last one I'm going to cover today is going to be the artisan. These are the people that you're going to sell your paintings and your statues to, because art is a treasure item in Dungeons and Dragons, and no one seems to think about this. And the reason I'm covering the artisan is because no one ever seems to think about the artisan. The thing is you're not going to go to a general store and trade, or more than likely, you're not going to go to a general store and trade a statue to the vendor, or you're not going to go to the weaponsmith and trade a statue to the weaponsmith because, well, they're just not, they don't deal with that kind of thing. So when dealing with vendors, think about what they sell, what they deal in, and if they're likely going to be able to resell that item. So that's kind of something to think about too, which I think I'll cover in a separate video, because this video has actually gone quite longer than I thought it was going to. I'm really quite surprised of the length of this. But anyway, folks, hopefully you enjoyed my rambling about vendors today, and it gives you some ideas of some world building stuff, and maybe even set up some adventures. and how to set up your vendors and what types of vendors you should or could have. But anyway, folks, I'm going to leave it all at that. Hopefully you all enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for tuning in, and have yourself a wonderful day.